Hi, everybody. Are we ready to start here? Welcome to our program tonight. And it's called Twice in a Lifetime Experience with an Exhibition on the Pandemic of 1918 and how it resonates in 2020. And our speaker tonight is Micaela Sullivan-Fowler. She's a librarian and a public historian, is a curator of rare books and historical collections at UW's Ebling Library for the Health Sciences. And in 2018, she installed an exhibition called Staggering Losses, World War I and the Influenza Pandemic of 1918. And little did she know that the exhibition would be shuttered by another pandemic, the one we're currently experiencing in 2020. She will give a short background on the exhibition itself, how the Spanish flu affected our local populations, and how the exhibition resonated for those who visited. And Micaela will also touch on the similarities and differences between the two pandemics. And she takes no responsibility for COVID-19, though her husband often refers to the current public health dynamic as the pandemic. Well, I'm sure that you're not responsible, Micaela, but you are knowledgeable. We're going to hear about that. Before we start, I'd like to tell people to stay muted during the presentation. And you may use the chat for questions, and at the end of her presentation, she will answer the questions. At that point, you may also unmute if you would prefer. I want to thank the funding for this program. I'd like to thank Beyond the Page. And what is Beyond the Page? Beyond the Page is a permanent endowment held by the Madison Community Foundation that annually funds humanities programming in all Dane County libraries. And we are really appreciative of that and benefit greatly from it. So I guess at this point, Micaela, we'll let you start in and we'll hear about this.
All right, I'm going to share my screen effectively, hopefully. Leah, I know how to do this, right? All right, from the beginning. Perfect. Can you all see that? Head nods. All right. And here we go. All right. Thank you so much for joining us. And I want to thank Gay Strandamo and the Waunakee Public Library for including me in this Uneasy series, which has featured discussions on environmental, political, and social topics of particular interest. And I'd also like to give a nod to the current pandemic, though perhaps ebbing into a period of Zoom fatigue, like so many of you may be. This format allows many more of us to be together than a conventional auditorium-based venue may have allowed. So I'm really glad you're here. And to repeat just a wee bit what Gay said, in November of 1918, just before the anniversary of World War I's armistice, I opened an exhibition called Staggering Losses, World War I and the Influenza Pandemic of 1918. Due to its popularity, it was extended into 2020, then had the ironic distinction of being an exhibition about a pandemic shuttered by another pandemic. It remains at Ebling Library, but currently has restricted access, as does the entire library. I'm going to mention World War I and its role in influencing medicine and healthcare, but mostly I will be discussing the pandemic and how it might relate to today's experience with COVID-19. I have about 30 minutes of, shall we say, formal presentation, and I'm going to take myself off the screen so that the red head doesn't keep moving around to see where she's supposed to be looking. And then I'll come back after the formal presentation and we can chat. So, Gay, can you take me off? I'm not sure how that works. Or maybe not. Maybe I'll just do it. Shall I just stay on? Stop share. Okay. I don't know how to do that. So there were two main themes that I'd like to share. One is the way the pandemic narrative was received by visitors to the exhibition. And because we have this unprecedented luxury of being in the time and place we find ourselves in, some of the similarities and differences between the two pandemics. So first, a little background regarding those staggering losses. Lots of statistics here, but basically the thing I want to point out is that the war was fought from July 28, 1914 to November 11, 1918, known as the Armistice. And America didn't join the war until April 6th of 1917. However, we had non-combatants there before, ambulance drivers, nurses, physicians, etc. And there were phenomenal amounts of casualties, which I'll talk about in a little bit, so I won't bore you by reading all of these, but you see that the numbers are in the millions, both in mortality, morbidity, wounds, and casualties. So lots and lots of people affected. The losses conveyed in this exhibition is a narrative of medical care, casualty management, individual prowess, trench warfare realities, impactful weaponry, and a virulent virus that wreaked havoc on an ill-prepared population. The losses, as indicated, were in the millions. They were not just in lives and limbs, but also in livelihoods, high school and college-age students, love and relationships and potential partnerships, children, artistic talents, musical prowess, educations, mental health, and creative pursuits. This was a loss of a generation of primarily men, but also women. There was the loss of opportunity and inclusion. Native American, African American, Asian, and Latino troops, who usually segregated during the war effort, still contributed to the American effort, particularly the French effort, of which was part of the Allied forces that we were part of, then came home and continued to be victims of Jim Crow and other restrictive political realities and social agendas. So this is what the exhibition looks like at Ebling. There are 13 cases total. 8 of them are basically about the medical care. And there'll be 2 examples of those cases. You'll notice that they're richly text-oriented, but apparently that was not an issue when it came to the narrative that was described. So these 8 cases cover first responders, nursing, triage, medical care, psychological aftermath, and the home front during World War I. Through photographs, postcards, books, newspaper clippings, personal journals, and published clinical articles, all from UW Resources, I used the stories, an important word here, of a number of individuals and events to represent the millions of lives affected. The strength of the installation was in the narratives that were revealed, the conjunctions made between the various disciplinary themes and the research opportunities that arguably still remain. Overall, these cases are about medical transport, medical care, reconstruction of bodies and psyches, animal volunteers, UW soldiers and students, people of color, both soldiers and caregivers, a virulent virus, and the indomitable human spirit, a resiliency of purpose that arguably has lessons for today. We can talk about those case titles during the question and answer if you'd like. I always give a nod to the phrases and expressions that initiate during the time period that I'm looking at, and it offers a cohesiveness to the material within the cases. So to break the ice at parties, and not for the faint of heart, one of the cases that I'm showing was devoted to the evocative illustrations of World War I's carnage. And with a quote like this, you can see how dramatic the illustrations were. The overarching sensibility for Staggering Losses was in the examining the relationship of medical care to war. World War I's sophisticated weaponry and murderous agenda ramped up the need for physicians, nurses, veterinarians, ambulance drivers, etc. We could include nature in this quote, but Khalil presented his paper before the pandemic. The wounds were often disfiguring, disabling, devastating mutilations caused by machine gun fire, mortar blasts, flamethrowers, grenades, mustard gas, tank fire, bombs dropped from zeppelins and airplanes, and shrapnel-laden ammunition. The loss of limbs, sometimes all four, one's face, hands, feet, eyesight, or hearing, often left young men and caretakers with a lifetime of pain and psychological consequence. One of the last cases within the military part is called home. And so as I move or evolve into the pandemic chronology, I mentioned the domestic nods to keeping the home fires burning and the memorialization of those that died. One of them was familiar to many, Canadian John McCree, he's on the right there, who died towards the end of the war. He was a poet as well as a physician and a soldier, and the author of Flanders Fields, which is a poem known to many that's read during the armistice, which is coming up in November, again, the anniversary. And here's part. In Flanders Fields, the poppies blow between the crosses, row on row, that mark our place, and in the sky, the larks, still bravely singing, fly, scarce heard among the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago, we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved, and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders Fields, which are still part and parcel cemeteries in Europe. This was also part of the 1920 Liberty Badger, which was the yearbook that was created by students for the students who were lost in 1918 at UW. So it's a very poignant piece. So we move into the pandemic. If you ever get a chance to read Catherine Ann Porter's Pale Horse, Pale Rider, it's a novella about the epidemic. It's quite moving. So some background. World War I ended November 11th, 1918, with over 17 million killed and approximately 23 million wounded. The addition of another cause of death and morbidity before that welcome armistice seems unfathomable. In March of 1918, on a farm in Haskell County, Kansas, the unthinkable occurred. What is now identified as a mutating H1N1 virus spread to military draftees at Camp Funkston, then Fort Riley, spreading germs to the Army barracks, then on trains across the country and on ships back and forth to Europe. While most agree on the H1N1 virus itself, renewed attention is being paid to alternate points of origin. Was it the British Army base Etaples in France from the virus and bacterial-laden conditions? Could it have been transported across Canada by Chinese laborers en route to Europe to work on the Western Front? Regardless of where the virus initiated, this much is indefensible. The epidemic, eventually a pandemic, traveled through the US, Europe, China, Australia, Africa, India, and onward, and millions of soldiers, civilians, and medical personnel succumbed to the influenza or its opportunistic bacterial pneumonia. About 500 million people, or 1/3 of the world's population, became infected with the virus, and the number of deaths was estimated to be between 50 and 100 million worldwide, with about 675,000 occurring in the US. Our number is now about 225, I believe. The pandemic was so severe that life expectancy in the US fell by about 12 years to 36.6 years for men and 42.2 years for women. There were high death rates in previously healthy people, including those between the ages of 20 and 40, with a disease that normally struck the very young or very old. Current research suggests that older people may have obtained immunity from the Russian flu in the late 1800s, but the 1918 strain turned deadly in young adults. The virus, now researchers think, covered itself in a protein sheath, astounded an individual's white blood cells, likely triggering what's called a cytokine storm, ravaging their immune systems. The 3 cases on influenza in the exhibition show examples of the plethora of articles, advertisements, newspaper clippings, and books written by physicians, nurses, and pharmacists in a narrow window of time on a disease that surprised everyone with its symptoms and mortality patterns. It rampaged through towns and cities, none with enough beds, medical personnel, vaccines, or coffins. Vaccines, not so much, except, or coffins to handle the hundreds and thousands of patients or victims. It incited panic in cities like Philadelphia, where 12,000 people died in fewer than 5 weeks. It mystified practitioners trying to quell a virus that took, on average, 3 days to kill. The so-called Spanish flu was an unprecedented enemy of public health. And a little on that moniker, Spanish flu, which is still used to this day. Initially, there was a press embargo against reporting on flu in countries such as England and France. Remember, we're at war, and they wanted people to volunteer. Spain did not have such restrictions, so as the disease spread through Europe, it was called the Spanish flu and was sometimes referred to as la grippe or grip. In actuality, its origin had nothing to do with Spain. And unprecedented perhaps, but as a prescient note, current infectious disease commentaries worry for our virus-laden future. I wrote this in 2018. Quote, "The past 100 years have been a ceaseless arms race against an enemy with whom we cannot negotiate," unquote. It's by Jeremy Brown, who wrote A History of Influenza 2 years ago. So we come to Wisconsin. In less than 2 months, in the late fall and winter of 1918, nearly 8,500 people in the state of Wisconsin died and over 100,000 were taken ill. I believe our number right now is a little over 1,400 dead. UW-Madison was not spared. 33 student soldiers, either in Europe or destined for Europe, were killed by influenza, often coupled with pneumonia, and approximately 39 students on campus died. Hundreds more became ill. With a student body of about 4,000, surely everyone knew someone who had been ill or died. In this case, we have Trueworthy Durgan with the best first name ever, the first rectangle down in the middle. He was the class of 1918 and he died at Navy Pier in Chicago, having enlisted at the close of his junior year. And Lloyd Dolan below him, class of 1921 from Rhinelander, was just 19 and died in North Carolina at a training camp before he could ever even go to Europe. According to Dr. Clark, quoted above, World War I was still killing and maiming our young men, and our university was struggling on under war conditions with many students under military control in the Student Army Training Camp Corps, the SATC, when the flu initiated. And keep in mind, Camp Randall, who many of you know of, was actually a depot for soldiers leaving and returning. The university club was used as an infirmary. Residence halls had temporary infirmaries on the top floors, while lower floors were used as barracks. A number of citizens in Madison opened their homes and received convalescent patients. Volunteer nursing help was supplied by the women of Madison. The most rapid spread, and here's the goosebumps, of the epidemic on campus was between October 1st and October 15th, 1918. And if you're following the news right now, although it's not campus centric, we are witnessing a surge in this area and in other parts of Wisconsin. A little bit more on UW and influenza. Sarah Morris, bottom right, came to UW from the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania in 1911 and continued until 1933. She worked closely with Joseph Sprague Evans, one of the founding members of the medical school here, devoting herself effectively to the medical and personal problems of the women students. She was instrumental in chronicling the shift from an academic institution to a militarized campus after America joined the war in 17. She helped immeasurably during the epidemic, including recruiting wives of faculty members to help in the dispensary. And another shout out, the flu is increasing up in the left-hand corner, is from the Wisconsin Historical Society, another wonderful font of information on Wisconsin history. So was there any treatment? What were the convalescent homes providing to heal those patients? Little something called vapor rub was helpful. Also, don't worry, stay quiet. Whiskey was a popular remedy, but many pharmacists suggested it might create more problems than it would solve. Aspirin was being tried in various areas, especially India, on soldiers, because it had just been developed by Bayer. And it might have actually contributed to more deaths than it helped, because they were giving massive doses and then having liver and/or kidney failure. Fresh air was always advocated for. Physician Wilberforce Williams in Chicago, he was in one of those other cases. In the Chicago Defender, he warned readers against unorthodox remedies, including asafoetida, which was a dried herb that was supposed to keep flu at bay. And E.B. White, the writer for The New Yorker, put all his marbles with black licorice. He insisted that as long as he ate great bags of it, it kept him influenza-free. What about Waunakee? It appears from a preliminary review that if on the left you look, there were people in Waunakee who were suffering from the flu, who were reported to be sick with the flu. But so far I haven't found that anybody in the immediate town died. However, the surrounding areas were a different story. As we can see here, it's not unusual that one family would have so many losses. I mean, they lost 4 members of the family within a very short time. And I've heard anecdotally that in rural areas in Wisconsin and other parts of the country, probably, if infants died or mainly infants, that they were buried on the farm, and whether or not those were reported to the state public health department is unknown, which also refers to another piece, which is the statistics about 1911. Flu wasn't even a reportable cause of death with the CDC, which was not yet the CDC. And so those numbers, that huge range of 50 to 100 million, has a lot of wiggle room in it. But even 50 is almost an unconscionable amount. So common concerns so we have a obituary or a column on a woman that died on the left, and the Ripon football game on the right that was called off. In 2000, history student Julie Haugen collected copies of the Daily Cardinal and Wisconsin State Journal, along with UW and medical school correspondence, mostly from the fabulous UW archives, and put it all together in a binder, which is available at Ebling Library when it is available. So on the left, a woman who dies, which both papers chronicled all the students and prominent townspeople who died from the flu, and it became sort of everyday news. And then we have the juxtaposition of the Ripon game, sort of like the sort of news that we now see between poignant obituaries and media accounts of people who have died, and then the memes about COVID-19 travails. So this is something else that we, within its media construct, we have in common with 1918. And her clippings cover every subject we currently hold dear: church attendance, school closures, movie theater crowds, how the governor and state were responding, campus directives, quarantine protocol. Yes, you had a green card placed on your house, which meant that you, your children, your dog or cat were confined until you had a doctor's note that you could leave the house. And these were all discussed in the press. So one of the themes I suggested I would talk about is memorialization. This is from one of the guest book that I had in the room. Jenny's grandfather died of the flu. Like the stories of World War I for the pandemic, I drilled down to singular people whose stories or articles could represent the hundreds, thousands, millions of people who had lost their lives in the pandemic of 1918. While I anticipated interest, I did not realize the power inherent in a 100-year-old narrative. Colleagues, friends, and family visiting the exhibition revealed that grandfathers, aunts, uncles, cousins died from influenza, leaving a legacy of sorrow and what-ifs in their family lore. Memories were shared with a wistful look and a renewed sense of consequence for those relatives whose lives were cut so short, so quickly by this virus. Visitors of all ages wrote in the guest book or sought me out. They'd lean into the cases, point at the clippings, photographs, and postcards, and speak reverently. My grandma had 2 younger siblings. They fell victim to the flu, a young man of 21, a young girl of 19. Both died within a week of one another. My grandmother mourned their loss for her entire rest of her life. And my grandmother died from the flu, leaving 4 children. My great-granddad had gotten a job. He died from the flu. His young son, my grandpa, had to work to support my great-grandma. And my own grandpa, an MD, died in the 1918 flu. He was an Army doctor at Fort Riley, Kansas. And you'll remember me mentioning that early. In that hallowed space, they remembered family members they'd not thought about for as long as decades. My work had transported them home. And in that moment, they recalled someone whose loss has created a cascading effect on their family history. Based on the last sentence of my apparently prescient exhibition essay, suggesting that a new global outbreak might make 1918 look like child's play, I recall thinking, if something like this happens again, we should do all we can to quell such loss. And as to the similarities and differences, on the left, a young mother in Dane County in 1918, masked. Yes, they wore masks, and yes, there were sanctions for not wearing them. There were ordinances against spitting and restrictions on streetcar riding. And the one on the right is a current poster up in the School of Medicine. Some basic differences between 18 and 20. Number 1, a different viral culprit. 1918 was an H1N1, today's is the coronavirus. Number 2, a different demographic in terms of mortality and morbidity. In 1918, the population most affected was young people between the ages of 18 and 32. Just think of that now, if it was now. Now it's mainly older or elderly citizens, many with pre-existing conditions. There are exceptions in both eras. The complicating factor in 18 was a bacterial pneumonia that opportunistically complicated the viral influenza. This is not as relevant in 2020, but the availability of ventilators, which is a point of debate, and the dynamic, debilitating, and apparent long-term effects of corona are informing treatment, patient morbidity and mortality, and public health policies. Number 4, the world was at war during 1918. Thousands of students were soldiers were transported back and forth on crowded troop ships, lived and fought in close-quartered trenches where diseases were easily transmitted. Losing loved ones to war and countless childhood and other communicable diseases that had not yet have treatment or vaccines we now enjoy was a somewhat routine occurrence in 1918. In other words, people were used to having their daily lives disrupted in ways that 100 years later, we, depending on our age, are not as familiar with. Resiliency seems to be the descriptor most applicable to the general populace in 1918. And 5, the medical, therapeutic, and nursing care has progressed in 2020 to include antibiotics and antivirals, though like in 18, there is, as of autumn 2020, no conclusive treatment or vaccine for COVID-19. And the similarities. Number 1, a tendency to blame other countries for the virus's origin or mismanagement of public health policies regarding the virus. A prime example, that descriptor, Spanish flu from 1918, and 2020's discussions of whether we reacted in time to avoid the mortality we are currently witnessing. Number 2, a tendency to withhold or paradoxically overshare information regarding the virus and its impact on the public, the healthcare system, etc. Social media, the traditional media, and cable stations all contribute to a daily barrage of news items we must quickly process. At the turn of the last century, there were hundreds of newspaper publications, telegrams, letters, chronicling the spread of influenza. And locally, like at UW, until someone died, public health officials kept referring to it as the seasonal flu, not the virulent, deadly H1N1. Information from officials or heads of state is dynamic. President Woodrow Wilson never admitted there was a problem or gave any guidance about influenza epidemic, though he did worry that troop ships might be carriers of disease. His General March assured him that the war effort needed soldiers and refused to curtail the travel. Wilson also contracted the flu, though not until the spring of 19, and later had a stroke, which some historians think may have had an outcome on decision-making during the Treaty of Versailles. President Trump, public health leaders, and state and local administrators often give uneven and confusing attention to the best protocols for curtailing, treating, and preventing the virus. Bear with me. Stay on task here. Confusing attention to the best protocols for curtailing, treating, and preventing the virus. Oh, and there was an election, a presidential election in 1918 as well. Such historical parallels. Number 3, the trajectory of the virus itself beginning in the spring, ebb and flow in the summer, and then the highest mortality in 1918 was the autumn and early winter. We wondered a month ago if that would repeat itself in 2020. And now current surges as our own and other states are unsettling. Number 4, the question of whether the virus will mutate and affect other populations exist in concert with the regular flu season for increased mortality and morbidity, and whether a vaccine can be developed and affect the strain likely existent in 2020 are continually newsworthy. I'm going to save that for question and answer. So 2018 to 2020, the last 2 years. And this photo is from California. From my exhibition essay at the end of 2018, quote, "It has been suggested that the pandemic was an overlooked, even forgotten event, that World War I and its dynamic, multidisciplinary narrative overshadowed the fleeting story of a simple virus. In truth, historians have recently shown that influenza informed everything from military transport to fighting readiness, to school closures, to burial practices and treatment protocols. Today, when we look at these conjunctions between all the display cases in the exhibition, the staggering mortality, morbidity, and loss, what rises to the top, what connects us to the realities of 100 years ago, is that we continue to worry for our loved ones, still wonder whether our leadership is sound, and still have faith that our health remains intact. We still worry about global conflict and whether we will catch the flu. Our world is very different than it was then in terms of robust worldwide travel, now curtailed, the global supply chain, and epidemiological record keeping. Medical treatment is more sophisticated, including established isolation protocols, availability of antibiotics and antivirals, and the existence of specialists in respiratory care and infectious diseases. World War I turned out not to be the war to end all wars. And the H1N1 continues to wreak havoc throughout various flu seasons, making the CDC remain vigilant. They fear that a new global outbreak will make 1918 look like child's play, unquote. That's from my essay. And I recall one infectious disease physician who visited and looked at me and said, quote, "You know, I keep telling them, we're not ready if this happens again." We are still being asked to stay home as able, wash hands, mask effectively, and to not gather in groups. Basic good advice in 1918, still good, albeit inconvenient advice now. I cannot think of a better way to honor the millions that died in 1918, or the over 225 who have died in 2020, 8 million worldwide, in the US, than doing our best. As visitor to the exhibition, Mr. Hovey suggested, quote, "In remembrance, may we resist repetition." So here we are in October 2020. What else would you like to know?
There is in the chat, there is a question that asks, how long did it take to recover economically and domestically from the flu?
From the 1918? I honestly don't know. The war complicates everything or informs everything. And certainly having everybody come back from the war, there was a lot of economic fallout from that, with housing and jobs, people needing jobs, all of the soldiers that were coming back. And there were a lot of industries that were either supporting the war effort, so the economy was not as affected as much as I think our current economy is being affected. And I think it rebounded fairly quickly, but I am not, sorry. I am not as informed about that as I would like to be. Does anybody else know? More of a World War I person than an influenza person? But I think that's the basic thing, that it recovered rather quickly. But actually, a dark side of that, forgive me, is part of the thing I talked about with segregation, discrimination, bigotry, etc. when the Black troops returned, was that they were in competition with the other Caucasian troops that were returning. And much of that was in housing and jobs. And the Jim Crow laws were effective in curtailing some of that behavior so that they were unsuccessful getting their lives in order the way their white counterparts were. I do know that about it.
We have a couple other questions. One, the first one is, was there a backlash about any of the things like mask wearing in the first epidemic? And it's another question. Got a few questions here. We'll start with that one.
Okay. There was. There were people who did not want to wear them. The Red Cross was providing them. People were also making them, just the way we did at the beginning of our sojourn into this. But there were also, there seemed to be a robust community effort if you were not wearing a mask, that it was sort of it had societal permission to suggest that people did wear their masks. And there were I think the picture in California suggested that they could go to jail if they weren't wearing a mask. And actually that was enforced in some parts of the country. And it seemed to have a more, it seemed that they knew that there was a definite connection between the wearing of the mask and the transmission of whatever it was that was causing all of this death. And they were very, what is that word when you take your drugs? When physicians always say compliant. They were very compliant. I've lost all my words. I just talked for 35 minutes. I can't remember what I'm saying. So yes, there was enforcement in 1918, but most people seem to be wearing them and washing them, because they were usually made out of 4 layers of linen, and then there was no elastic, so they were tied behind their heads, and not nearly as robust artfully as the ones that you can buy on the internet now. What else?
I have a lot of questions here.
Oh, yay.
You know about regional differences in the response to the influenza, in regional differences, I guess, throughout the country. And also there was another question sort of like that. Did the population decrease a lot in the whole country or in certain areas?
It did in certain areas. And the regional differences was probably about enforcement of staying out of groups. And of course, it helped if you weren't in a densely populated area. Philadelphia and Boston and New York had some of the highest rates of mortality. And this also came, the timing of it was bizarrely serendipitous in places like Boston and Philadelphia, where they had big, what were called bond parades around Armistice Day to buy bonds that would help support the military and or the soldiers coming home. And so all of those things that we worried about recently with large groups of people, they eschewed those, and there were tens of thousands of people that marched without any masks. And then I think I said at the beginning of this, 12,000 people died in Pennsylvania within a very short time. Same in Boston. One of the reasons one of the impetuses for doing this for me, besides the anniversary of the pandemic 2 years ago, was because my history advisor, Lester King, who is an MD and also a historian, was 10 in 1918. And he related to me that one of the things that sort of kept their play from being as fun as they hoped it would be was that they were always having to step over dead bodies on the sidewalk. And I wondered if that was apocryphal or actual. And it was probably real, because over 9,000 people died in Boston in a very short period of time. And there were not enough coffins. There were not enough funerary morticians to help, et cetera, et cetera. So there were some regional differences. Cities with large immigrant populations had higher levels because they lived in tenements and they were all closer together. And outlying areas or areas with not as dense populations and more outdoorness seem to have lesser amounts.
You mentioned immigration. Someone did ask if immigration was curtailed during that time, the time of the influenza.
No, I don't think it was.
No. Okay, there was no immigration.
But I don't know that for certain. Does anyone else? I don't think it was. Because there were just amazingly robust amounts of people going to Europe and coming from Europe, et cetera, and leaving Europe because of the war and coming to the United States. So I don't think so. I don't remember reading that. What else?
I have something in the chat about those interested in the economic impact in Wisconsin of the flu pandemic of 1918. There's an excellent article in WisContext, and she does give a link here.
Oh, terrific.
Public radio,
Yeah.
public television.
It's, I guess, provided by public radio, public television.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I have a feeling that might be part of the binder from Julie Haugen, the history student too. But it wasn't something that I looked at for the exhibition. So I will be sure to look at that. Thank you.
Okay, it says, as a public historian, librarian, and archivist, what items are you preserving, if you are, for an exhibit on the pandemic of 2020?
That's Sarah. I started collecting articles and essays, etc., from the web probably back in December of 2019. I then sort of lost control of all of that. And I have a guide to doing research on the pandemic of 1918 that the General Library System and Ebling Library are hosting on their library pages on how you sort of put these sorts of stories together. And a lot of those early articles on similarities and differences are there. The clinical article, and the news articles are just gargantuanly huge. However, I'm not doing this, but in Wisconsin, which any of you would be able to contribute to, I believe, is both the Wisconsin Historical Society and I believe the Madison Public Library, and probably most historical societies in your areas, if you're not from Wisconsin, are doing oral histories, are asking people to send in journal contributions about what this has all felt like, and are attempting to collect various newspapers, which are generally in databases now, about the trajectory from February forward. Thank you, Sarah. Yay.
I have a couple questions here. I think you kind of answered one. Were Black people affected more than Caucasians in the influenza epidemic? You mentioned some things about that.
This really, in 1918?
Mm-hmm. In 1918, right.
Yeah. They were and they weren't. And I don't think I will do justice to this So I'd like to read you just like a 2-minute thing. This is from historian Vanessa Gamble, who, excuse me, who writes on the subject of African Americans and equity in healthcare. And the quote from the American Journal of Nursing in 1919, "This pesky flu is all over town, and white and black and rich and poor are all included in its tour," unquote. Historian Vanessa Gamble suggests that when the 1918 influenza pandemic began, African American communities were already beset by many public health, medical, and social problems, including racist theories of Black biological inferiority, racial barriers in medicine and public health, and poor health status that they started with. To address these problems, African Americans mounted efforts such as establishing separate hospitals and professional organizations and repudiating racist scientific theories. Contradicting prevailing theories about African Americans' increased susceptibility to disease, it appears that during the 1918 epidemic, the incidence of influenza was actually lower in African Americans. Although the epidemic had a less devastating effect on African American communities, it still overwhelmed their medical and public health resources. Observations about the lower rates of influenza in African Americans did not derail racist theories about biological inferiority of Black people or overturn conceptualizations of Black people as disease threats to white people. When the epidemic ended, the major problems that African Americans faced still remained. And it could be a whole nother discussion on its impact currently. Thank you for that question. What else?
Okay, I think based on all of the connections between these pandemics and the apparent lack of learning from the 1918 one, the person asks, what do you hope we can learn and apply to the next pandemic?
Oh God, we gotta get through this one, don't we? I don't know. I mean, and when I was going over all these notes and spiffing it up with the stuff with the news from the last couple of weeks or last even couple of days, I wondered the same thing, and I'm not sure. The thing that I'm newly thinking about is this sort of food for thought, which, tell me what you think, compared to 1918. So the social and cultural trajectory that we're now looking at with this virus is becoming increasingly protracted. I mean, in 1918, it was generally a few weeks, perhaps 2 or 3 months of a really robust quarantine ethos. The economy, schooling, social events, restaurants, jobs, children's mental and physical health, the isolated elderly, they were affected a much shorter time than in our current landscape. I mean, we've been doing this since March, at least in Wisconsin. It's a long time. And I don't know what to make of that. I don't know about suggestions of mismanagement, overreaction, seasonal flu. I mean, we're all moving indoors. There's been another shout out I'd like to give Wednesday night at the lab, which is a fabulous lecture series at UW. They had a number of epidemiologists and infectious disease people at the anniversary in 2018 talking about the pandemic and then what might happen in the future. And I don't know what to think about that. in terms of how we've handled this one and what it means for the winter, from October through December through January. And whether or not the virus itself decides to do something fancy. I mean, the viruses live to be viruses. And we don't yet have a vaccine. That's been fraught with a number of issues as well. And so I don't know what to think about that. Anyone else have thoughts?
Well,
And especially about this protracted.
I think it's hard for us to know because there's so much we don't know. There's so much not known about this virus, and it's kind of hard to judge it, even or to compare it when we're in the middle of it. I mean, Micaela's done a great job of the similarities and differences, though, and has been just a font of information about the pandemic of 1918, which I do think was overshadowed by World War I. I don't remember hearing much about it at all.
Yeah.
Let alone seeing those pictures of masked people, which is, oh, wow.
Even dogs,
Yeah.
even their pets.
Mm.
Yeah. What else? What can I tell you?
If someone wants to unmute and ask a question, that's
Yes,
fine.
I would love that. And thank you for all the links and URLs to other information. Great. I couldn't figure out how to do that.
Hey, Micaela, it's Andrea.
Hi.
How are ya?
I'm good. I'm so glad to see you.
Yeah, let me put my camera on. Question for you about how long did it take them to come up with a flu vaccine with the 1918 pandemic, or did
They actually didn't. When I said vaccines and then I said, oh, not vaccines, they didn't.
Okay.
The first vaccines really weren't until the 1930s.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And keep in mind that, I mean, here's the naysayer. HIV still doesn't have a vaccine.
Yeah.
I mean, and we're assuming that COVID will stay in its COVID state for whatever vaccine they develop, right, Andrea? Isn't that
Right.
how
Yeah.
vaccines work? So I'm hopeful, but I don't know that that will be a quick answer for it.
Right. Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah. Yes, Sarah. The flu vaccine, yeah, it's based on the strain. I mean, even the swine flu was an H1N1, and a lot of commentators have asked about why, because the swine flu killed tens of thousands of people across the world, and we did not at the time mask or restrict group movement or close down schools, et cetera, et cetera. But that was an H1N1 also, but a different strain than the one that we all probably just got our flu shots for. So it's kind of based on whatever the one before and what you think the immunity was based on being exposed to that one. Is that a fair thing, Andrea? Andrea's a clinical librarian, or was?
Yeah, I would say that's a fair description. I mean, it is kind of a guessing game, but you base it on the previous year and your projections for the coming year.
I'm going to
You
say
wanna-
something problematic.
Yes.
I've been thinking a lot about the swine flu, and I wonder if the difference there is that it didn't affect as many proportionally in the United States as it did in other countries and other nations. So it was easier for us as Americans to ignore the severity of that particular strain because we weren't personally being affected by it at the same rates as people in other countries.
Yep. True. Yeah. The provocative part of
Hi.
pandemic things. Hi, Penny.
Hi. so along with that swine flu, that, what are we talking, like 2008, was it?
8.
Yeah. And that typically affected young children.
Yeah.
You know, so again, the demographics kind of prevented people from, you know, capturing it
That's a
and
good point.
understanding it, unless you have children that were affected by it. And also, I wish we could get information out more. The more I talk to people, they don't quite understand how our flu vaccine every year works. They think they get the flu vaccine and they have 100%
Right.
control. And once I tell them that it's a crapshoot, basically, if we hit the right one or didn't hit the right one, they're just shocked, because they're like, oh, we've got to get this vaccine for our
Apparently
problem
it's
now. And
successful if it's 10%, which that's according to some epidemiologist at the Wednesday night at the lab, who said if you don't end up in the hospital and you don't end up dead, it was effective. Because I've had the flu every January for the last 3 years, and I've been vaccinated.
Yeah.
So,
you know, so people are thinking that the vaccine that is being developed is going to be the panacea, right? And cure it, but we're not curing anything. And it doesn't mean we still don't need to be taking the precautions as we should be doing with the flu every year.
Right. Good point. Very good point. Well, I've kept you so long. Is there anything else? And then, if not that any of this is filled with great amounts of whimsy or angst, but I could tell you about a historical failure when I was at my exhibition reception, if you'd like, to end on a lighter note. Shall I?
Sure, of course.
Okay, so there were 3 MDs who had come to the exhibition, and there's a big case on the animal volunteers. And before I started this research, I had no idea about all the mules, horses, dogs, elephants, camels, pigeons, etc., that had volunteered for World War I. It was absolutely extraordinary. And tens of thousands of them were lost during the war, killed by bombs, mortars, etc., etc. And farmers' animals were taken from them for the military, etc. It's just this huge, poignant, deeply rich story. And one of the MDs said to me, what is your favorite part of all the research you did and all this exhibition? And keep in mind, there's like, Sarah, 400 parts to this exhibition. It's just thing after thing after story after wonderfulness. And I said, oh my gosh, the ferrets. And Dr. DC said, the ferrets? There were ferrets? What did they do? I said, well, they were messenger ferrets. And at that point, I don't know what I'm talking about, pretty much, except I think I remember something about ferrets during the research. And he said, well, did they have like little backpacks for the messages? Because messenger pigeons is one thing, but messenger ferrets. And I tried to curtail this conversation into other conversations. And then I went home and I thought, I've done a 1.5 years of research for this thing, and I come away saying something like that, ferrets. And so I got up at 3 o'clock in the morning and I looked, ferrets, World War I, blah, blah, blah. It was a thing. They were, but it wasn't messengers. They were rat killers in the trenches. And they came from Serbia. They were bred expressly, expressly to be sent to Britain and France for the trenches. And they would kill the rats, which were an amazingly difficult and insidious problem. Them and Jack Russell Terriers were sent for the trenches. So I was vindicated. I sent a note to the 3 physicians and I said, blah, 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 ferrets, they really were, linked to a YouTube video. And Dr. DC wrote me back, just the pinnacle of etiquette and wonderfulness, and said, I'm so glad you could ferret that out for us. So, so if you don't know what you're talking about, yeah, I don't know, as a historian. Yes.
Thank you
But
so
won't
much.
that, if you're ever on Double Jeopardy, you'll know, ferrets.
Thank you so much.
Oh, you're
Micaela.
welcome.
This has been very enjoyable and informative,
Thank you, Anne.
even though the subject at hand, of course, is
I
not-
know,
but,
it's very difficult to
the light
find
note
whimsy.
ending is great. And thank you, everybody, for participating. I guess
All these people, this is so
we'll-
cool.
yeah, we'll let her let her go ferret out something else.
Yeah.
Right. And everybody have a good night. This will be recorded. If you'd like
Yay.
to watch it again, it'll be on the Waunakee Public Library website. So
Thank you so much, Gay, for the invitation. And thank you all for coming. Good heavens.
Thank
Send me an
you.
email.
yes.
Yeah. Did I ever show you my screen? Let me do that real quick. Do we do that?
Sure.
Can we? Where am I? Power. Share. Oh, we didn't talk about like 40 things we could have talked about. This is me. There's my email. There's my phone number. You can text me. You can send me pictures. And if you're in the area, we could probably do a one-on-one masked exhibition-y thing because it's all still there. And I've gotten a couple grad students in to look at it recently. So we can do that safely. Stand 6 feet apart, take a selfie. We can do that. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Bye, Meg.
Bye. Andrea, it's so nice to see you.